In this tutorial, I'm going to cover making paper trees with a cutaway that reveals a winter scene inside. I made my first tree back in 2016 and I recently decided I wanted to add more trees, so I thought this would make a good video tutorial, and I will cover both the first tree I ever made as well as two more. I'll start with the first tree I ever made and also start with the base. For this particular tree, I decided to use a silver bowl that's turned upside down. Then you can see there's a piece of wood, and then on the top is a circular wood piece. The circular wood piece I purchased at Michael's craft store, and it's 6.5 inches in diameter. You could also make this out of chipboard. I would just suggest that maybe you do more than one layer of chipboard so that it's sturdy. And then the reason I used the wooden piece in between the silver bowl and the round base at the top is so that the placement of the house that I'm going to put inside the tree ends up where you can see it. And it'll be more clear to you as I continue through the video and we get into making the tree itself. Inside the tree is a house, and that house sits on a base, and then all of that sits on top of the round wood base. Now the house itself and the square base that's under it are made from a chipboard kit. And there's also other things that come as chipboard as accessories that you can add to the house. Before putting the chipboard base together and the house together, you need to decide whether or not you want to have lighting inside your house. The whole thing looks pretty even without the lighting, but I just think the lighting adds something extra, especially at night when you're displaying the trees. On the house kit, if you look at the base, it already comes with a pre-cut hole. So if you want to use lighting for this, you'll want to remove that piece before you put the house together. Now for the base, there is no hole. So for this project, I actually cut a hole in the base, and you want to use your placement of your house as to where the hole needs to be. And then you can see here, I'm placing my house farther to the back. That way you can see all the stuff in front, the stuff landscaping around the house. And the reason you want to do this, you might think, oh, well, to turn on my light, I can just lift up the house off the base and go underneath and flip the switch. But the problem is that it's difficult to get the house by itself out and not have the stuff in the front blocking it and making it really hard for you to do that. So I found it was easier to combine the house and the base and then cut the hole in the base so that I could have access to the tea light that I'm going to be putting inside. Before assembling the house kit, I started by painting the windows and also painting all the edges that would be potentially seen. And then so that I could have the light inside and it would glow through the windows, I covered all of the windows with vellum. I then attached the walls to the base, and then for the outside I took some paper that looked like wood and cut it into small pieces, small strips, and then glued that all around the house, making sure not to cover the windows and not to cover the doorway. For the roof, I used a stencil, and I used just daubing the paint on the top of the roof. I didn't paint it other than just using that. And then if you look at this picture, you can see that I've also added dormers to the roof and a chimney that comes as another kit. And then I covered everything with the sparkle that you see there, which is Twinklet's Diamond Dust. And then there's another chipboard kit that you can use to add the trim for the windows, and that's what you see on the fronts and the side. And then the front door comes from a collage sheet that has really tiny miniature doors, windows, and other Christmas type decorations that are perfect for a project this size. And then on the base, I painted that white, and then I covered it with some snow flocking. And then you can see that I added acrylic decorations, mooses and trees to the base. And then I put a strip in the front that says "'Twas the night before Christmas." And then that will sit on the base, but I don't attach it to the base because remember, I've got a light underneath it. Hanging down the sides of the house, the roof, are icicles Those were made by a company called Doris, and they went out of business a couple years ago, so they're no longer available, but you might be able to source them somewhere else. This second house, this is a new one to go with one of the new trees, is very similar to the first house. It starts out with the same base and house kit. The approach is the same. I'm painting my windows, edges, and then adding the vellum before I put the house itself together. For this particular one, I don't have to cut a hole in the bottom because it's the newer kit that already has the hole in the bottom in the house. But just like the first kit, in order to accommodate the lights, I do still have to cut a hole in that chipboard base. The paper I'm using for this house comes from this new pad called Italian Creative, and it's a 6x6 pad, so the scale of the wood images and the bricks and the stone is something that's better for a small project like this. For the roof, I used these chipboard shingles, and they come in a sheet. I used 3 sheets to do this. I painted the roof shingles with various shades of gray, and then I just overlapped them slightly and glued them to the top. I also glued pieces of it to the front. You'll notice for this house, I did not include the dormers, although I did add the chimney. What I did is I took the kit that has both of those and I split it between this house and the next house I'm going to show you. So I put the chimney on this house, and I'm going to put the dormers on the other house. Another difference with this house is I put a porch on the front. And again, it's just a little kit and that is sized perfectly to go on the front. And inside that, I used a door image that came from the same collage sheet where I got the door image for the first house. Now, the windows that I used are the same ones that I used from the kit for the first house, but just like with the dormers and the chimneys, I split the windows between this house and the next house, because when I added extra things to that house, I needed some more windows. So I'll cover that when we get to that house. And also notice that I do have more of those shingles on the top of the porch. Now, the scene that you see, the brick walkway in the front, that's more from that paper pad. And then I've got some green trees. Now, these are they're actually flat, but you can't see the back, so you don't know that. And I changed the color a little bit because the green wasn't really much of a tree-looking green, and add more of that snow to the trees. And then in the front, you see that there is a little birdhouse and 2 little birds. Again, the birdhouse is a kit. And then I just attached a wooden dowel to that to be the pole to hold it up. And then the base is just made out of polymer clay. You could use paper clay also if you like. And then you'll see there's a little owl bead sitting on the chimney. And then above the porch is an acrylic icicle. The final touch was sprinkling the entire scene with iridescent mylar flakes. For the third house, I'm using a completely different kit. This kit can be used as a dollhouse where the front of it is hinged and you open it up and you see 2 floors of the dollhouse. Or you can use it like I'm using it, which is just a house in the scene, and the front will not open. It'll just be closed. Now you can see the pieces of the kit here. There's a back, there's a bottom, there are the 2 sides, there are the 2 floors, the pieces that you can see in the middle there, and then 2 pieces for the roof. Now, for the purposes that I'm using this, I want to light it, so I don't want those 2 floor pieces inside, because otherwise it would just block the light and you wouldn't see it through all of the windows. So when I put it together, I used all of the pieces with the exception of those 2 pieces that would actually be the floors of the house. Now, the kit also comes with the facade, the layered facade, which is what makes it, I think, look really cool. And here you see it's these 3 sections that one lays on top of the other. So the very first section that you see there is what goes on the very top. Then you've got panels that go on top of that. And then you've got trim to go on top of the windows that are on the 2 panels and the door as well. So since this project is not going to be a dollhouse where the front opens, but it's going to be a house in the tree, I want you to take a look at number 1. One of the other modifications that I had to do was that very front piece facade that has the cutouts for the window and the doors, that needs to move down to the bottom of the structure. And the reason is you can see where the door is located. It would be very weird for the door to be off the ground. I suppose if you wanted to leave it that way, maybe you could build some little steps in front of it. But what I did is I just shifted the whole thing to the bottom to cover the base piece. And so if you look at number 2, to start with, I am cutting a piece of brick paper. This is from the same paper pad, big enough to cover the entire front, to go from the bottom of the roof all the way to the bottom of the piece. Now that I've cut the paper, I'm going to go ahead and punch out these pieces on this strip here of chipboard. If you look at the very first one on the right, now that will be mounted behind the brick paper, and then you would want to cut out the windows and doors so that those are open again. That way you'll get the light through, and then glue that to the structure. And remember, you want to glue that first panel at the very bottom of the piece of paper that you've cut out to mount on the front. Then the next step is the center pieces. There's the 3 center pieces, and you can look to the right, upper right, and you can see what that looks like when it's all 3 pieces are put together. Then I just painted those and then attach those and glue those over the first panel that you have behind the brick paper. And then finally the last set is the windows and the door, and you'll want to punch those out, and then again I painted those, and then those will go on top of the windows that are in the second panel. So since I lowered all of the panels with the windows to the bottom so that the door itself would be on the ground, I ended up with a big section of empty brick at the top. And so what I did is I used some of the window frames off of the strip of window frames that I used for the second house, and glued those to the paper, and then cut out the holes for the windows where the frames are. And then of course I mounted vellum behind all of this like I did on the other houses, so that you could see the light all the way through. And then I ended up also putting a little strip of brick paper between the 2 sections of windows. It looked kind of strange just to have those 3 windows that were different than the ones below. And then, as I said earlier, I used the dormers on this house, and I used the chimney on the other house. And I used again through this strip of window frames. I used that around on the dormers, and I also backed that with vellum just so that it wouldn't look different when the lights were off, and without having any holes in the roof, and also with the dormers just being empty, you would, through the windows, you would see the roof tiles. And I guess if you did want light to go all that way, you could go ahead and cut some holes in the roof, and then the lights would go all the way up into the dormers. The final touch are the paper icicles that I added. That comes in a little sheet. I used a couple of those sheets. And then I also added some of that flocking like snow to the icicles. And then here you see the final house with the lights on. To make the cone for the tree, I am using paper, the type that, the brown paper that you use to wrap packages to put in the mail, because it's flexible, but it's sturdy, so it can hold the cone shape. And the paper that I found this time isn't quite as heavy as the paper I had for the first tree, which I liked a little bit better, but it still worked fine. And you're going to be adding some structure to it when you add your decorative paper to the outside, and then of course if you do anything decorative paper wise on the inside. And what I did is, you need, if you're going to make one the size that I did, and of course if you're going to make a smaller one or a larger one, you're going to have to adjust, but to make the one I'm making, which works for the 6.5 inch diameter base, I used a piece of paper that would be 20 by 20. That gives you plenty of paper, so you'll probably have a little extra left over. And I'm going to make a cone that is 18 by 28. So it's going to be 18 high by 28 inches around. Now, that's the amount around is a little bit more than the circumference of the 6.5 inch circle, but you need some extra because you need to overlap the paper to get the cone shape and to glue one piece to the other, one side to the other. Better to have too much than to have too little. You can always cut some away, but you can't add back. And the technique I use is, it's a little bit more time consuming, but I get a better result. So I start measuring 18 inches from the one corner of the paper down 18 inches and marking. And I just make small marks by continually moving the ruler a little bit over, keeping one end at the corner of the paper, and then I slowly make a semicircle, and then I go around and just kind of fill that in to make it easier in between each of the markings that I made to make it smoother. And that gives me my cone. Now, I've also seen it done, and I've tried this before, where you can take a piece of string and tack one piece at the corner and then make it, say, 18 inches long and tie it to a pencil or a pen at the other end, and then just move it around. The only problem I have with that is you have to be really steady with the angle of the pen or pencil. If you change angles, if it slips at all, then your semicircle is messed up. So it takes a little bit longer to sit and just measure it out all the way around. But at least I get a much more accurate cone, and I don't get frustrated because I have to keep doing it over because my pencil moved a little bit. Now, once the cone is made, now I have to figure out how I am going to attach the paper to the outside. In other words, how I want to lay it out, where I want the different decorative papers to be. And the thing that I would suggest is do as little overlapping as you have to, and use as big a pieces as you can. I mean, I cut some of mine in half, 4 inches wide, 6 inches wide, because I wanted to have the different patterns. But if you start piecing lots of little pieces, then what can happen is, even if you do a really good job of gluing everything down, as you're bending this cone around, some of the little pieces, the edges can pop up. So I would just, be mindful of that when you're laying it out. And then I'm also have to be mindful of where my frame is going to be, where I'm going to cut my opening so that you can see the scene inside. So basically, I just take my cone, lay it flat, lay all my paper out, figure out how I want it done. And once I get that done, then I'm going to start attaching the paper to the cone. Now, the one thing I do before I do that is I do put my frame where I want it, and I mark the edges of the inside of the frame. So that way I don't waste paper going over that place that's going to be a hole. Plus, it makes it stiffer when you do that. So yeah, I just kind of lay my paper out around the hole that I'm making for the frame. And like I said, if you mark where that is, then it's easy for you to not overlap there and to know where you want things. Because some of the paper, like the blue paper here, I wanted the trees to be in a certain place on the paper. So I'm not just willy-nilly putting it anywhere. I've had some thought about where I want certain things. Next, I attach the paper to the cone, and you want to make sure that this is glued down really well, and particularly the edges so they don't pop up. And then once you get it all glued on, I glue some, I trim it to the cone, I glue some more on, I trim the excess away from the cone, and rather than trying to trim it all at once, because you lose a sense of where the cone is if you don't keep trimming what you're gluing on. And then the final thing would be to glue on the frame and cut out the hole that's in the middle of the frame. Now, one of the things I would suggest is don't let your glue dry completely. Let it dry enough that you're going to, it's not going to shift as you make your cone, but you don't want it to dry completely, or the paper gets super stiff, and then it gets really hard to bend this into a cone shape. And so what I do is, I used Mod Podge, and I didn't let it dry completely, but while it was still somewhat flexible, I bent it into a cone shape. And then you can use clamps or some rubber bands just to kind of keep the general cone shape. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exactly like it's going to be when you glue it together in the final step, but you just want it to have that cone shape, because I'm telling you, it's really hard if you let it dry completely. And then it can kind of warp as you're trying to do it because it's so stiff. Another reason for bending it into that cone shape and just temporarily with rubber bands, clamps, whatever, clips, keeping it in place is I find it's easier when I do the embellishments on the outside to put them on when it is in the cone shape, because you don't want to attach the embellishments in any way that's going to prevent you from turning it into a cone. So if you go ahead and turn it into a cone, at least the general shape where it's bent, then you won't be attaching things that won't work out when then you go to put it into a cone and things are popping off, or you just can't bend it because of somehow you've glued your embellishments in place on the outside. For the first cone that I made, after I got the cone, all the paper on and whatnot, for the embellishments, I first put a rub-on on each side where I'm going to put the embellishments just to kind of add a little bit more detail. And then I used a combination of gold and silver glittered picks. I also used some paper flowers and some acrylic snowflakes. And then you can see on the one side, I also used, kind of in the front a little bit, is the Dresden swan, white swan. And then I also used, you can see in the top left-hand corner, some of the icicles. Now, the one thing that you need to be thoughtful of when you do this is you need to make sure that whatever embellishments you're putting on, it will not get in the way of you pulling your house in and out. For the blue tree, I am using some white paper leaves. I'm also using some more of the silver picks. And then I'm also using some leaves that look very glittered and sparkled. Those are actually paper from one of my collage sheets. And I have added the Twinklets Diamond Dust to that to make them sparkly. And then you also see the beaded sprays that are coming out on each side. I wanted something that was more three-dimensional and maybe not a flower, but something that could be like a flower, or it could be kind of snowflake looking. At the top of the blue tree are a section there of icicles, and they are covered with that flocking type snow. And that's the a larger version, a chipboard version of the ones that I used on the third house. And at the bottom you see a little banner that says Winter Wonderland. That comes from a new collage sheet of mine that is full of all kinds of banners with different holiday and seasonal phrases. To make the beaded element, the beads themselves, I used the beads that you see here and put them on a head pin, and then made a loop, and then I strung all those on a wire. And you just use as many as you need. And then to get them to stay together, just stringing them on a wire and twisting the wire is not enough to keep them stiff where you want them. So I hung them upside down. I twisted the wire, got it as tight as I could, hung it upside down, and then I dripped some glossy accents over the bottoms where the loops are. And that, once that dried, that made it dry in the position it's in with everything hanging down. But with the glossy accents, I could also kind of bend out some of the beaded pieces so that they were in a better position, because once you're hanging upside down, they're all going to be more straight, and I wanted them a little bit more open. So I very gently bent them out and just made them look more like a flower. For the last tree, all of the embellishments are on the front, at the top and the bottom. There are gold glittered picks, and then there are more of the leaves that I used on the one before, except these are gold instead of silver, and they're covered with the Twinklets Diamond Dust. And then the papers that I used to cover the cone with had some flowers on it, and so I cut those out and layered them, and in the center are some little gold beads. And I did the same on the top and the bottom. The only difference is on the bottom, I also have added some pine cones. And then at the very top, or towards the top of the cone, you'll see another one of those banners that says, "'Tis the season to be jolly." Now, another thing that the decorative paper had on it that I used for this was it had images of ornaments. And so I thought it would be pretty to add some beading to the front to kind of look like ornaments hanging. To make the ornaments, I used a head pin to attach the beads to a chain, and then I used a heavier piece of wire, and I strung those on the wire and then looped the ends so that they would not come off. And then I glued that to the top of the opening in the cone in back behind so that you wouldn't see it, and then they can hang there nicely. The third house is different than the other two in that it's much taller, so I could not use a base underneath this or I wouldn't be able to get it out through the hole. So that meant also that I couldn't put anything in front of it. The other scenes have some things in front of it like birdhouse, trees, stuff like that. So this all had to be around the outside. So in the front there you see a couple of deer, and they are white, and I painted them black, and their ears beige, and their noses and their hooves black. And then you see these other trees that are covered with beads. Those trees, I started out with the basic tree, and I painted it a little bit greener. The color was kind of weird. And then I covered it with the flocking snow, and then the base is made out of the polymer clay like I did for the birdhouse. And then you'll notice it has all these little beads on it for ornaments, and those are the same beads that I used in the center of the flowers on the outside of the cone. And then you can see another one of the green, little small green trees I used in the beginning with the same kind of snow. One of the things that you might have noticed is the jeweled trees that are on each side of the cones for this project. And that was another project that I did several years ago. And if you're interested in that one, I will have a link to that project below in the description area, and that'll take you to my blog where you'll find the tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Down below in the description area, you will see a link to my blog, which will contain the supply list and also more pictures. And then there'll also be the link for the jewel tree tutorial.